You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey of the Wealth Formula Podcast. Today, I want to start out by reminding you that there is a site called wealthformula.com where you get all sorts of goodies, such as downloads and free books, including 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth, which I consider my Wealth 1.0 starter book that you can simply also text me, 44222, and type Wealth Formula, one word, and you will get that in your inbox. Also at wealthformula.com, it's an opportunity to sign up for what we call Investor Club. Investor Club, of course, is the home base for the accredited investors of Wealth Formula. And what is an accredited investor, you ask? Well, an accredited investor is nothing more than somebody who makes $200,000 a year, $300,000 if filing jointly, or has a net worth of $1 million outside of their personal residence. So in other words, to become accredited, you don't actually do anything. You either are or you are not, sort of like being pregnant. Does that describe you or not? And if it does describe you, the good news is that the world is opening up to you, the world of private investments and private placements where the rich really make their money. So go ahead and check that out if that describes you. If you're an accredited investor, go to wealthformula.com and join Investor Club. We'd love to have you. Lots of things going on there that will help you to take that lazy money and put it to work once and for all. I do also want to point out that I would like you to mark your calendars. The next Wealth Formula in-person meetup and lecture day, etc., will be on September 27th and 28th, I believe. It's a Friday and Saturday. It's going to be in Dallas. And I want to make sure for those of you who are diehards, who want to make sure that you can join up, that you get an opportunity to mark it on your calendar and don't make other plans. Again, that is September 27th and 28th. And we might actually add an extra day to that on the front end for some other optional type activities. But it's going to be in Dallas again. Dallas, it was in Scottsdale last time, but this time we're going to do it in Dallas so that we can get some of our East Coast folks out because Phoenix is a long way. I know. I was coming from Santa Barbara, so of course Phoenix is like an hour and makes it really easy. But Dallas is in the middle of the country. Dallas is where we own a lot of property within Investor Club. So we're going to spend some time driving around those, looking at those. But we're also going to have a lecture series. And for those of you who came to the Scottsdale event, you know the biggest part of this is just meeting each other. And we have probably the most extraordinary podcast listenership of all. I truly believe that. And hopefully you will see it for yourself. If you can't make the live events, there's also the Wealth Formula Network, which you can join, which is our private group. Go to wealthformula.com or wealthformularoadmap.com. And it's a course that's also linked to our private Facebook group and also our bi-weekly mastermind calls, which people really enjoy. So check that out. As for today's show, it'll be it's a familiar face you're going to see today. We were going to talk to. My guest today in Wealth Formula Podcast is Jorge Newberry. Now, George is a guy who knows a lot about debt. Debt. Let's go back to debt and talk a little bit about that. Debt is like a lethal weapon. It can be used for good. And it can be used for greed, right? You thought I was going to say bad, but, well, it is kind of bad. But it can be used for good or it can be used for greed, right? It can be used to create wealth and it can be used to destroy it, right? In short, debt is nothing more than a tool. The problem with any tool is that a fool with a tool is still a fool. So debt gets a bad name because of this. But the reality is that in skilled hands, debt can be used to create unlimited wealth. In Investor Club, we use debt to create extraordinary strategies like infinite returns. We use it for wealth formula banking, Velocity Plus, all of these extremely powerful strategies we use with the purpose of utilizing debt to create wealth. However, debt is also, unfortunately, the opioid of the poor, who often use it to pay their bills so that, when you don't have a paycheck coming in and you got a little bit of credit, you're going to use it. And in situations like that, debt can be absolutely devastating. That said, debt is like a loaded gun with good intention. Sometimes debt can explode at unexpected times and create unexpected casualties. That's why it's always important to respect it and fear it, just a little bit. It's kind of like those people who drive motorcycles. You might be a person driving a motorcycle. I'm personally not one of them. Why? Because I used to be in the neurosurgery business, and we used to say in neurosurgery that motorcycles are there to keep us in business. Anyway, debt is sort of like, using debt is sort of like driving a motorcycle. You have to respect it. And if you just, lose that respect for a second, it can take you down in a flash. And, the reality is that many smart entrepreneurs have experienced this firsthand. You've gone through that painful process where you've used debt the way you're supposed to build a business. And the next thing you know, boom, maybe you over leverage, or maybe you just, you just got caught in a situation that you never thought you would be. And all of a sudden, good debt goes bad. And, George Newberry is one of those guys. He is a serial entrepreneur, one of the smartest entrepreneurs I've ever met. And using debt at a young age, he was worth millions of dollars as a real estate entrepreneur. You can read about this in his book, Burn Zones. Then one day it suddenly went south and came tumbling down. Literally, an act of nature took down his entire empire, and debt made it even worse. A lesser entrepreneur might have been wiped out for good by that whole thing that George went through, but not George. Not only did he overcome the debt, but he built an entire career based on it, and he's got a fantastic insight on it now. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Debt is a big part of getting rich. Learning about it is the key to becoming wealthy. And that's why we got George Newberry on the show, and he'll be with us right after these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is, he's a guy who has been on the show 4 times now. That is a new record for Wealth Formula Podcast. His name is George Newberry. He's a friend of mine and one of my favorite entrepreneurs. You may know him best as the guy behind American Home Owner Preservation, initially what is now called AHP Servicing, and he remains chairman of that company today. In the meantime, though, in true serial entrepreneur form, he's found another problem to solve, and it relates to the area of bad debt, and he's going to tell us all about it today. George, welcome back to Wealth Formula Podcast.
Hey, I appreciate you having me back, Buck, and I'm glad to hear my guest appearance are setting a record pace.
It is record pace. There's nobody else who's been on 4 times, but you were there at the very beginning. So even before there were listeners, I don't think you knew that there were no listeners, but you came on this show. But that ended up being a good relationship overall. So I'm glad you could join us here a couple years later. So I want to talk. We're going to talk about some of your new stuff here. So in the last decade or so, you've really built a career based on bad debt, right? I mean, first of all, it was with AHP Servicing, which is a fund that buys non-performing notes, and now you got Debt Cleanse. I mean, these are all sort of in this world, and of course, there's a reason for that. Because you're an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs tend to look for opportunities in whatever predicament they find themselves. And yours was, of course, outlined in your book, Burn Zones, which a number of people have read. But for those who have not, give us some of the cliff notes on that to sort of put your life in perspective that got you on this in the debt industry.
Yeah, it wasn't what I set out to do. But in roughly... on Christmas Eve 2004, I owned over 4,000 apartments across the country, and an ice storm hit my largest holding, which was the 1,100 unit Woodland Meadows Apartments in Columbus, Ohio. And it triggered this extraordinary sequence of events in which I lost everything and ended up $26 million in debt. Now, I never filed bankruptcy. Instead, I noticed that one of my creditors made an error, and I sued him, and it went to court. I won. They appealed, and the Missouri Court of Appeals ended up issuing their decision that the creditor had inadvertently extinguished a $5.6 million debt, and I didn't have to pay. Now, this was a turn. I know, it was for me at the time when I was in a severe predicament. It was a turning point, because what I did after that, I was thinking, well, if this creditor made this type of modest error on this huge debt, which extinguished it, I wonder about all of my other creditors. So I went back and I found repeatedly that creditors were making mistakes, small and large errors, and these were done by small and large banks.
So, George, talk about some of those errors, because I'm just curious. It piques my interest. Like, what, in the case of this, $5 million, $6 million loan? First of all, was that was recourse debt? That was not. You were taking all guaranteed loans for all this real estate?
Yeah, most of this was personal guarantees, and that $5.6 million was personally guaranteed, and even better, it was secured by by two apartment buildings, in fact, and one of them, they had to release the mortgage on it, and it was a 200 and some unit apartment building in Oklahoma City.
They had to release it, meaning that you were debt-free from that?
Yeah, they threatened to appeal again, and so they agreed to take $225,000, which is less than 5 cents on the dollar, on a mortgage secured by an apartment building worth millions of dollars.
That's unbelievable. So in the case of let's talk about some of the errors that you run into with these creditors, just as an example, because I think the story is fascinating. What, in this case, with the $5 million, what did they do wrong?
Okay, this one's kind of complicated, but kind of fun. So follow closely. So this one, when I bought this property in Oklahoma City, maybe 2002 or 3, somewhere around there, and the property was in disarray, which is, I always buy the most challenged properties. So this creditor said, okay, we're going to make you a loan and call it $5 million on this property, but you have to give us security, blanket the loan with another property that's in good shape, that's cash flowing and whatnot. So I said, okay, I'll give you this other property in Kansas City. So they made the loan secured by a first mortgage on this property in Oklahoma City that was troubled, and a second mortgage on a property in Kansas City that was cash flowing and in good shape. Now, it was a second mortgage and there was a first mortgage from Wells Fargo. So there really wasn't that much equity, maybe $1 million in equity at most in the Kansas City property. So the real equity was in Oklahoma City. Now, after the Woodland Meadows fiasco, I ended up in trouble on all my properties. And so the lender started foreclosure on both properties at the same time. And in Missouri, it's a non-judicial foreclosure, which basically means that the creditor does not have to go to court. And as a result, that foreclosure went very, very fast. They also started foreclosure in Oklahoma, which is a judicial foreclosure state. They need to go to court. It moves very, very slow. So they started foreclosure in Missouri, and within a couple of months, they were holding the sale. And I remember the sale because I sent out a representative with a $10,000 cashier's check, and I thought they were going to bid some modest amount, maybe up to 100. I was prepared to pay $100,000, and they showed up, and so my guy starts the bidding, and he goes $10,000, and then the attorney for the creditor says $5.6 million and whatever change. And so obviously that was the end of the bidding. They won. But here's the theory, is that a creditor can use their debt to bid at a foreclosure auction. But if they use all their debt, that means the debt is gone. So
oh, wow.
Yeah. So what they should have done is bid like $1 million, and then they'd still have $4.6 million due on the Oklahoma City property. But instead, They bid the full 5.6 million. They owned the property in Missouri, so I lost that.
This was a big bank. This was like a local bank or what?
It was a commercial creditor. It's a company called Vestin Mortgage, Vestin. They were publicly traded at the time. It's funny if you know them.
Yeah, no, I don't know them. I just think it's funny that you're.
Yeah, it's publicly traded, so they were decent size, but they just took a beating on that one. I mean, the court decision. So what happened is then I realized it. I didn't realize it right away. I just said, dang, I lost that. And then that night I was running to kind of release some stress, and it popped in my mind, wait. I came across like this realization. I called my attorney and said, hey, I think they made a mistake. And he said, no, you're right. They did make a mistake. We went to court and in Missouri, and we ended up winning, and then it went to the Missouri Court of Appeals.
So how did you think of that? I mean, you're not an attorney, but I mean, did you read something, or was it like, how does it make sense that they pledged money that they are?
Yeah. So yeah, that wouldn't that happened 10 times. I would say that 9 people would miss it, and probably half the time I would miss it. It just happened that I had a similar situation maybe 10 years ago. I ran a mortgage company, and the situation doesn't come up so much with the elements that I just described, but it does happen is if you use all your debt to bid on a property and there's insurance proceeds. That's what happens very often. So let's say a home is damaged by a fire and it's a $20,000 loss, and then the bank comes in and forecloses and bids all their debt. Now they do that. If they bid all their debt, they are not entitled to the insurance proceeds. But if they bid all their debt minus $20,000, they are entitled to the insurance proceeds. And that has come up a lot in court. So that's the situation that I had been involved in. So that's why I remembered. But I would say that most people would not recognize that. And knowing that, over time, I said, as fast forward to Declan's today, the vision became, hey, how do we create kind of a checklist of all these potential mistakes that a creditor can make? So when you run into a situation where you're unable to pay, you can kind of look to where the creditor could have made a mistake. Otherwise, it's just different attorneys, me, kind of debtors coming up with random, hey, this might work. And so I wanted to make it a formula.
So I think the moral of the story is, and I think this is really powerful, is if you get into trouble and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? You need to make sure that you have all the paperwork, and that make sure that that's where even the big banks, the big institutions or whatever, make a little bit of mistake, and then they could end up not being able to recover money from you, right? And I mean, that's sort of the moral of the story.
Absolutely. It can be tremendous. As soon as they make a mistake, that can be tremendous leverage to utilize to arrive at a discounted settlement. So they'll discount their position rather than litigating the error that they made.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about your view on debt in general. First of all, let me ask you before that. You never filed bankruptcy. Why? Because I think a lot of people in your situation would file bankruptcy. Tell us exactly kind of what bankruptcy is, because most people on this listening to this show are not generally people who have filed bankruptcy or have had to even think about it. But what exactly is bankruptcy, and why didn't you do that?
Sure. So bankruptcy is a court function, a judicial process, which you can relieve your debts. And relieve is kind of a broad term. There's multiple different types of bankruptcies. One would be a Chapter 7, which not everyone will qualify for. Generally, if you have limited or no assets, limited or no income, you can qualify for Chapter 7, which allows you to completely extinguish your debts as you go through the process. At the end of the bankruptcy process, all your debts are gone. Now, if they're secured by a car or a home, those are things that will not typically be discharged in bankruptcy. And so when you have a house or a car and you have any kind of significant income or assets, then you're oftentimes end up doing a Chapter 13. The Chapter 13 is a monthly payment plan. Generally doesn't work out that well for the people who file, instead it works out pretty well for the bankruptcy attorneys because they usually get paid first before anybody. And what happens so many times is that someone will decide, okay, I'm filing a Chapter 13. They will pay the fees, and then over time they will be unable to make the payments, complete the plan, and make the payments to the creditors. In fact, over 66% of bankruptcy Chapter 13 filings are not completed. That means the people don't complete making the payments. And so now they're even worse off because now they paid, several $1,000s to an attorney in court costs to file this bankruptcy. And now they're back to where they are. All the creditors are due what they were due before, plus additional late fees and court costs and all that. So I'm not a big advocate. There's one more, just to let you know, Chapter 11 is a business bankruptcy. But again, a business bankruptcy looks to be very, very expensive. For businesses, you have to appoint a trustee on both the Chapter 13 and the Chapter 11. And people say, "Oh, I filed bankruptcy," like that's everything goes, and it's really not. It ends up sometimes opening up more problems than it's worth. And I'll tell you, I'll tell you what my hesitations are. If you have bad credit, if you just don't pay a debt, and it shows up in your credit, it can stay on there for 7 years. If you file bankruptcy, it's going to stay on there for 10 years. So it's almost 50% more. So if you're an entrepreneur, like most of your listeners are, and they do kind of find themselves in a predicament because something doesn't work out and they end up filing bankruptcy, they will be kind of in the credit penalty box for 10 years. If you don't pay if you just don't pay stuff, then you're out for 7 years. But another thing is, repeatedly, if you ever have to, if you apply for a job, if you apply for a license, if you are trying to get approved for some kind of government program, many times they're going to ask you, have you or any companies you've ever been involved with filed bankruptcy? And I can rightfully say no, because I never have. But they rarely do they ask, have you or ever your companies not paid their bills? It's just not a question on there. So
how did you know this though? I mean, how did you know not to do this? Because I think like the reflex most people would have
is to file bankruptcy.
Yeah, I mean, especially maybe not even on the personal side, but say if you've got a business, I've talked about having a failing business recently, and it did occur to me at one point, maybe it makes sense to file a business. So this was something that a business back in Chicago, and so, but you said no, and I think there was lots of good reason for that. But even for a business not to do that, how did you know that? How did you know you'd be better off? I'm curious.
Well, I have to say it wasn't an easy decision. I actually talked to a bankruptcy attorney. They prepared all the paperwork. I was on my way to drive to go and sign it, and I just couldn't do it. It seemed like I was admitting failure, and I kind of thought I'd rebound faster than I did, and I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But it ended up being the right thing. I mean, there were other reasons not to file bankruptcy. I had a huge loss that I reported on my Irish tax returns. I had over a $20 million loss, which I've been able to carry forward and use as an offset against future tax gains. And my accountant at the time said, if you file bankruptcy, that loss carried forward goes to zero. So you have nothing. So actually, if you go $20 million, and most people have less, but it's still usually oftentimes a significant amount, that's a loss that you can offset your future income against and tax again in most cases. So that is a big asset. It's not really listed as an asset, but in many respects, that is an asset that you lose if you file bankruptcy.
Right.
Also, most entrepreneurs, I think, also would face this, and I think you would be in this position, that if you file bankruptcy, you're kind of making the statement that, hey, these are all my assets, these are all my liabilities. But so many entrepreneurs have all kinds of like different interests in different businesses, little interests here, they partnered on something, they invested on something. And if you list all that, if you forget to list something, that's a problem because you've now misrepresenting what your assets are. And so I always thought, I still was trying to hustle and get things back on track. And so I did have little things going here and there, and I'd have to kind of give all those up. So that was another reason where I just didn't want to do it.
So let me ask you this. Through this, obviously you were a real estate investor, very successful sort of real estate you were basically flipping big buildings. You were doing it with your own money. There was a huge amount of money that you were, you were worth at one point. When you think about it now, do you have a perspective? People talk about good debt and bad debt. I certainly talk about that. Do you believe that there's any kind of good debt?
Yeah, I mean, when I was building my empire, I took out loans. I mean, I didn't have any partners, but I took out debt from banks, and that was good. I wanted more debt to build my portfolio, and that was so it was helpful to the point at which what the natural disaster occurred, and I wasn't able to pay everything back. But if there's debt that you can afford, use for business purposes, use as a means to improve your life circumstances, certainly that can be good. But there is bad debt, definitely, and I would call this, especially on the consumer level, where there's predatory debt products that are created by Wall Street that are marketed in a predatory fashion to Americans. And this would be things like payday loans, just terrible for businesses, merchant cash advances, just terrible. There are a lot of subprime auto loan products where, buy here, pay here. You see those buy here, pay here signs at these car lots. And although you're buying the car there and you're paying it, oftentimes those loans are packaged up and securitized and sold on Wall Street. So you really think you're paying the local dealer, but really you're paying Wall Street, some Wall Street affiliated fund. So those are, and these are products, oftentimes the rates are 18%, 20%, sure, high origination fees. And those things, I would say, are absolutely bad debt. A lot of the subprime mortgage products that came out in the 90s and the 2000s, bad debt. And I think the list goes on. There's a lot of bad debt type products, and they take advantage of people.
Yeah, and I was curious about that because obviously you were using leverage in the way you're supposed to, but even in those situations, there are situations where it doesn't work out. And so do you find yourself even probably more cautious? I'm sure you're at least more cautious now of feeling like, there is sort of a level of leverage that you're comfortable with and not wanting to do more than that.
Well, regardless of what I feel, for almost a decade, no one would loan me any money anyway. So I didn't have much of a chance to leverage.
There you go.
Leverage anything. So I'm very unlevered right now. I have very little debt personally, and in my businesses, very, very little debt. But that's my credit. Funny. That all happened 15 years ago, 14 years ago, but it was with me. Some of those cards and debts kind of weren't like, okay, this guy's not going to pay. They weren't charged off or reported as delinquent for several years. But either way, at this point, my credits, they're all gone. And my credit score is, into the 700s. Yeah, I have excellent credit, which is really funny. And I work for a company called Debt Cleanse. So why anyone would make me a loan today, I'm not sure. But some of the banks do.
Yeah, and the irony there too is that you have a business also that people are they have bad debt, and you don't want them necessarily not to pay their debt to your fund either. So you got to be careful they don't reach your.
Yeah, I know there's a slight conflict of interest. I'm kind of playing on both sides of that. But here's the thing. So that's a great point. I appreciate you bringing that up. So American Homeowner Preservation, the strategy there has always been to reach a consensual solution with the family. It hasn't been to squeeze every dime out of them we can. And I think that's where Debt Cleanse is. The goal is not like if you have a mortgage, the goal is not to get a free house. I mean, I actually happened to almost do that with a free apartment building. But that is a rare occurrence, nothing you can count on. But most of the time, you can find enough errors that you can get a good resolution, which will allow you to stay in the home if that's what you want, with some affordable payment, maybe some reduced principal. Those are some of the benefits. And so I think all these types of debt is to get to a solution that's good for both the creditor and the debtor. And I think HP does that. So as a result, people shouldn't be. HP will give you the good deal up front. You don't have to litigate to get it.
So you've got this book that you wrote. It's a big book, big fat book.
It sure is.
And it's called Debt Cleanse, obviously named the same name as your business. and we're going to link to it on the show notes and website. But it's so its thesis is a bit controversial. I mean, it's really I think the central idea at the end of the day is, well, don't pay, right? And so it sounds, I think, for most people who get into a little bit of trouble, it sounds a little bit extreme. Do you want to talk a little bit about your philosophy in this? I mean, you talk about sort of, wearing your poor credit on your sleeve, and all this kind of stuff that I think is pretty. Again, it's different, right? You don't hear people ever talk about this, but I found it fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about sort of your approach?
Sure. So the theory and its reality is that the best way to gain leverage over creditors is to stop paying. You can't say, if you call the bank and say, hey, I'm making my payments, but in a couple of months, I don't think I'll be able to make them anymore. Can you modify the loan? It's just never going to happen. And in most cases, they think that the debtor is so concerned about messing up their credit that they're going to make the payments. But when you stop paying, all of a sudden, okay, wait. It usually moves to a different department. Let's kind of work this thing out. And that is where you gain leverage. And also that's where the lenders start making mistakes. They may have made mistakes throughout, but especially once you're behind, they can miss deadlines. They can send notices out too early, too late. They start making collection calls. They can call you too early in the day, too late in the night. All those things, it's ripe for errors. And that's your opportunity. So here's to step back, here's kind of the greater thesis is that if a consumer or a small business owner today recognizes that at some point in the future, in the next 6 months, I'm not going to be able to keep up with all this stuff, it's much better to proactively stop paying your debts today. And when you stop paying, it's stop paying them all. As opposed to what most people do, including me when I had this situation. When I started running behind, I didn't have enough money to pay all my debts. So each month I pay a little bit here, a little bit there, and kind of trying to keep them all like at bay, hoping that they don't sue me. But what that did, it just took the resources that I did have, the money that I had then, and it kind of spread it out and made me weaker and weaker and weaker. And eventually I was in the point where I financially collapsed and I had no money to pay anybody. And now I didn't even have no money to pay attorneys, to settle debts at discounts. I just couldn't do anything. So I urge your listeners, if they feel that they or a friend or family member, business owner they know is in that predicament, is to proactively stop paying. Set the money that you have aside. Now you have money to pay attorneys who can help, and you also have money to settle the debts at discounts if and when it makes sense for you.
Right. Yeah, and it's totally an eye opener, I think, because I don't think that, again, most people. First of all, I think people who, most of the time when they get into trouble, they have no idea what to do, and if they do something, it's usually some sort of bankruptcy or something like that. But it is a really interesting, I guess, lesson learned that you've kind of shared. So talk a little bit about the business debt cleanse. How do you work?
Sure. So I'm going to step back just a minute as to where debt cleanse it started. And because when I started AHP, I kind of knew the concepts and I applied them as I built AHP. But we would buy pools of mortgages from banks and then go to those homeowners and say, hey, we bought your loan at a discount. We wouldn't say that, but we said, hey, we can offer you a discounted settlement. You could reduce your payment, reduce your principal, settle your delinquency for a big discount. So we would help people. And then they would, their friends and family, they tell their friends and family, hey, I got this great deal on my mortgage. And they call us and say, hey, AHP, can you buy my mortgage too? And I certainly understand that, but I don't own your mortgage, so I can't help you. So we felt kind of bad, a little bit like, God, I wish you could help these people. So I came up with a few bullet points as what to do if you can't afford your mortgage. These are a few steps that you can take in order to maximize the likelihood that at one point your loan is sold to a debt buyer, not necessarily HP, but somebody, at a discount, and they can share that discount with you. So that was the theory. And one of the big step one is to just stop paying. If they hadn't already paid, most of them had already stopped paying. So we did that, and but then we got a lot of requests. And then somebody said, "What about my student loan?" And so I finally decided to write a book, which is Debt Cleanse: How to Settle Your Unaffordable Debts for Pennies on the Dollar and Not Pay Some at All. And in it, there's a step-by-step process for each type of debt, be it a student loan, a payday loan, a mortgage, a vehicle loan, a business loan, all types of debt, credit cards. There's a step-by-step process for each. And so I said, okay, I put out the book, and I thought, okay, this is going to address the issues of all these other people whose loans AHP does not buy. But as soon as you solve one problem, typically another one appears. So on this one, people started reaching out to me by email and social media, and they'd say, hey, I'm following the steps in the book, but I've got to the point where I need an attorney. And I am in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm in Los Angeles, California. I'm in Miami, Florida. And so I get these requests, and I'm thinking, I have no idea how to help these people, because when I was in trouble and I went to attorneys, there were some that were helpful, and there were others that were very, very unhelpful. They really didn't know what they were doing. And some of them just were kind of offended by the fact that I hadn't paid. I remember one attorney I went to, he asked me a couple of questions, said, hey, did you sign the papers? And I said, yes. Did you get the money? Yes. Well, then you got to pay it back. I'm saying, okay, well, if I don't have the money to pay it back, that's really unhelpful advice. Right. So it didn't help. So the vision became, how do I train a network of attorneys across our country in every state? And then I create a platform to connect debtors, consumers and small business owners who are struggling with their debts with these attorneys that are now empowered with these strategies. And so that's basically what Debt Cleanse Group Legal Services is. We've created a platform where consumers and small business owners who cannot afford their debts can connect with this network of attorneys, and they get a few things every month. The charge is $29 a month for consumers, $49 a month for small business owners, and they get a half an hour consultation each month with an attorney licensed in their state. They get a 10-page document review, and if they engage the attorney, they get a 25% discount off the attorney's rates. And I'll tell you, a lot of these attorneys are working for, $100 an hour, $150 an hour, $200 an hour. They're definitely, one attorney's working for $50 an hour. And so there's a lot of attorneys that are working for very affordable rates. Lots of times, not only are they applying the 25% discount, but they are going even less than that on their regular rate, just to attract, because they're sympathetic to the cause, and they want to help people.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. We were talking a little bit offline about this. From the perspective of what what you're trying to accomplish here. Going to a $500 or $600 an hour attorney versus $100 an hour attorney really doesn't get you 5 times the talent, right? I mean, most of the time you end up with somebody who's probably not interested or used to dealing with, debt types of issues, unless it's a big corporate debt issue, and they just end up charging you a whole lot more. But what you've created, I think, is interesting, is that you're the one who's really, you're not an attorney, but you've studied this stuff so much that you're actually you're teaching these people all the nuances, because you've kind of been, in that fist fight before. You know all what's going on. And a lot of these attorneys, even if they're, super expensive, high-powered, quote-unquote high-powered attorneys, they only know it at a theoretical level.
Absolutely agreed. What the strategies that we share are not taught in law school. In fact, it's almost like street fights. And so these really well-heeled attorneys are not good at street fights. In fact, lots of times they're the ones representing the banks. And when you're these little needlesome, attorney and consumer or small business owner who's kind of kicking at their feet and finding their problems and calling them on them, it really becomes you become a nuisance. And let me share a statistic. In this country, for every 100 credit card lawsuits that are filed, 93 of the people that are the defendants will not even answer the lawsuit. They think that they know they got the money, they know they used the credit card, and so they just think there's no way that I'm going to win in court. And so they let it go to default, and then, couple months later, they're getting their wages garnished, their bank account levied, any properties being liened. But the 7%, the people that answer the lawsuits, and especially with our methods, that then they find any problems that the creditor made, they're getting calls. At some point, the creditor or their attorney's calling the debt cleanse attorney saying, hey, what does your client want? Let's make a deal. And that is really the, it really is the way to gain leverage, by being the exception. Think about it. You're having these debts just go down this kind of conveyor belt through the process. But once they connect with debt cleanse, the debt cleanse attorney, it kind of falls off the conveyor belt. And now it's stuck, and there needs to be some kind of customized resolution. And that's what we force. It becomes costly for the bank or the creditor to fight it. And it makes sense for them just to make a deal.
So with regard to credit cards, and I know, again, reading some of your book, I was kind of amazed at, I think you said somewhere like it was the average settlement on a credit card default is something, was it like 7 or 8 cents on the dollar, or was it maybe 4 cents on the dollar or something like that? Well, what is it?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a Federal Trade Commission study which studied debt buyers, and the average credit card debt sold for 4 cents on the dollar.
4 cents on the dollar. And when you guys are doing this, when you guys have your debt cleanse attorneys, is that kind of what you're seeing? Or are you seeing a little bit more than that because you're actually trying to settle it as opposed to something that's defaulted and can't be recovered anyway?
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing settlements that are larger than that, but they're not. We're trying to get on credit cards. If we can find problems, it can be in the 10, 20 cent range. And so really severe discount. Now, one thing that it takes patience to get numbers like that. They're not going to happen in the first 6 months or year. Sometimes it has to go from, and I think that's where the 4 cents number comes from. Lots of times, you don't pay American Express. They sell it to a debt buyer or assign it to a collection agency, and then they'll try for 6 months or a year. Then it's sold. And they'll try for 6 months or a year, then it's sold again. And each time it's sold, it gets sold for progressively lower and lower amounts. And so eventually, there's a point at which, A, you may never pay it, or you'll settle for some massive discount.
Right. Well, the last thing I want to point out is that, these issues are not just affecting people who are, poor. It's affecting people with money, people who are more affluent. They get into trouble, and if they, if they can't get out of it, it could take them down completely, right? Everything else they have because of one mistake or one type of situation. When you have, in terms of your debt cleanse business, what kind of clientele are you seeing? Are you seeing are you seeing a mix of demographics?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a mix of demographics, all income levels. I mean, people who have very limited means, very limited assets, they may be better off filing a Chapter 7. And so this may not be the ideal situation. But as soon as you move up the pay rung or the income and asset ladder, and for instance, someone who couldn't file a Chapter 7 but would need to file a Chapter 13, absolutely, in my mind, debt cleanse is a better solution for that person that's in trouble with their debt, and on up the income levels. What surprised me a little bit in the early couple of months of debt cleanse is how many small business owners we're getting. And these are people who are coming to us and, hey, I have millions of dollars in debt. And I say, wow, this is, I didn't know, I knew there are people out there that are in trouble with debt, but it's been a higher small business owners and entrepreneurs who are in trouble with large size debts, but a lot of them are ending up here. Yeah,
that's fantastic. So the site, is it debtcleanse.com?
That's it.
Debtcleanse.com. And the book, Debt Cleanse, if you're looking for some summer reading, of course, George also wrote Burn Zones, which probably a lot of people listening to this podcast have read, which outlines his his whole rise and ultimately the the fall that he described in multifamily real estate. But where can we get the Debt Cleanse book? I mean,
sure. It's Debt Cleanse book is on Amazon. It's on Audible. You can buy it at Walmart. You can buy it at Barnes and Noble. So it's actually available on a number of different outlets. It's on Apple. So any of those outlets, I urge you to pick up a copy, especially if you're in debt. Absolutely. If you have a friend or family member or someone you know that's in debt, I think it's a great gift. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's a good point because, again, a lot of people here are going, well, I'm not in debt, but this is an interesting conversation. A lot of people around you, guarantee you're going to have people around you who will get into some trouble, and it might be worth mentioning this because these are some really unique strategies that I think were pretty eye-opening and, frankly, just financially just fascinating to me. So anyway, George, I want to thank you again for making it number 4. And I'm sure we'll have you on soon, probably for the newest business.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Buck. And I wish you well with your podcast. It's great to see how much it's grown. So kudos on your success.
Thanks, George. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. It's always a delightful time to have George Newberry back on the show. He is a guy who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I just want to take a few moments also here just to remind you again to mark your calendar for our next Wealth Formula event. Looks like September 27th and 28th in Dallas. Mark it on your calendar. We're going to cap the event again, probably between 100 and 120 people. So when we have the official announcement, don't wait long because we got filled up pretty quick. A lot of people didn't get to come. Also, just want to remind you again that if you want to get more involved with Wealth Formula, consider joining Wealth Formula Network. Wealth Formula Network, of course, is our inner circle. And Wealth Formula Network, you can sign up for it at wealthformularoadmap.com. But basically what it is it's a course, and a course with some very smart people in it, talking about real estate and taxes, like Ken McElroy and Tom Wheelwright. And then we also have a private Facebook group that becomes part of that experience. The private Facebook group is you. It is investors who are really into this stuff. We also do bi-weekly Zoom video conference calls for our mastermind. So it's pretty involved. And so if you like to geek out on personal finance, and your wife, your family, your neighbors don't want to do it with you, join us. A bunch of outcasts talking about personal finance every other Wednesday. That's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.